Is free speech clear to you as a concept? There's been quite a few debates, especially in the digital age, what it means to violate freedom of speech. There's been a lot of new, like novel mechanisms for people to communicate with each other, like especially on social networks. And it seems that unclear because a lot of times those are managed by private companies. It's unclear how much protection do the citizens have to have when they're communicating. A lot of people are being censored on these social platforms. Some people, even presidents, get removed from those social platforms. Have you thought about the freedom of speech in the United States, but in the world, uh, as it as it's implemented in the 21st century, given the internet and all those kinds of things?
There is a Soviet dissident named Natan Sharansky who survived the regime, and he wrote a book in which his thesis was essentially the way that you can define a free society is through something called the town square test. Can you go to a public space where you live and criticize your ruler loudly without fear of retribution? If you can do that, you have free speech. I think that's a pretty good litmus test. Most people in this world cannot do that. If you live in Havana, if you live in Moscow, if you live in Beijing, you cannot do that. And that's not a free society. In Austin, Texas, in Boston, Massachusetts, in London, in Santiago, Chile, in Tokyo, Japan, in many democracies, you can do that. And I think that that's a really helpful basic sort of litmus test.
Does the content of the criticism matter? Can it be complete lies, meaning conspiracy theories that involve claiming that the leader is, let's say, a lizard slash pedophile slash, I'm not saying that those are lies, look into it, but they're very unlikely phenomena. So, like, does that matter?
I think it ends poorly when the state tries to restrict speech. I think that's kind of how I would define censorship. I think censorship and deplatforming are two different things. Private companies, they get to make up their own rules about what's allowed on their platforms. And I think that's very different from a government with guns and an army restricting the speech of its citizens with threats of violence. These things are different for me.
That violence is a fundamental difference. I don't know. I've gotten the chance to have dinner with Alex Jones, and I've talked to him a few times offline, and I understand why people are so off-put by him, but it does bother me that he's universally removed from every platform. It feels like there's many more evil people, bad people, compared to Alex Jones, who still are given a voice on these platforms. And so I'm uncomfortable with the universality of the application of this censorship by these platforms. But on the flip side, you're right. There's not a violence. There's not tanks. There's not guns behind that censorship.
Yeah, it's a bit of a generalization, but Alex Jones would be in prison or dead if he were in North Korea or in Cuba or in Russia or in China. The authorities would not tolerate him to do what he did. And here he can kind of do what he wants. He's encountering some resistance in the marketplace of ideas. Large organizations, corporations, and a lot of public sentiment in different parts of our country don't like him. They're doing their best to drown out his voice. But that's very different from a violent threat of censorship from the state. And that's what we study. That's what I study are these, what is the state doing? That's kind of paramount for me.
Yeah, and that's true. Because in the marketplace of ideas, there could be a company that springs up that gives Alex Jones a platform, and the United States is not going to prevent those companies from functioning. Of course, there's from a technology perspective, there's AWS removing Parler from the platform. It gets a little weird, as you get closer and closer to the compute infrastructure, because then you get closer and closer to the state. Actually, the more you get to the infrastructure that's usually managed by the state, the closer it gets to the control of the state. I would argue AWS is pretty damn close to infrastructure that's kind of controlled by the state. If you especially look at other nations, China, Russia. There's I don't know who runs the compute infrastructure for Russia and China, but I bet the state has complete oversight over that. And so that level of compute infrastructure, having control about which social networks can and cannot operate, is very uncomfortable to me. But you're right. I think it's good to focus on the obvious violations of these principles as opposed to the gray areas. Of course, the gray areas are fascinating.